some of your names from before because I saw you guys in the previous classes. So hello again. So let me introduce myself. I'm Edward. I go to North Creek High School, and I have gotten like a five on every one of the AP histories, right? Like world, US, and Euro, and then also human geography to top that off. So I like to think that I know like a thing or two, right? And I like to thank Bakewin for giving me this opportunity to teach. So let's begin. So we're going to be covering like the units from 1 through 9. This is going to be mostly content focused. And then on Friday, I'm pretty sure we'll be going over some test taking strategies by going over some practice problems for a push. So unit 1, we have natives. It's about the natives before the European contact, right? So do any of you guys know why the time period for this is so specific from 91 to 1607? Because I know in AP rule, the time frames, right? It's not too specific. It's like 1200 to 1450. So would any of you guys like to type in the chat why you think it ended? Well, why you think this is the time frame? Yeah, correct, Jerry. So it's from the Columbus landing to the beginning of slavery. So let's get into Unit 1.1. And this is about contextualizing early Americas. So this is all about how native cultures, right? Like the natives that were around here before this time. You don't have to know like the Aztec, the what were the other ones? The Maya, the Inca. You don't have to know, you'll have to know those later, but not for this one. So this is 1.1 is all about that. The main theme that you have to take off from this is that native cultures were significantly shaped by their environments, right? So the Pueblo, they were the people in the Southwest that used maize and like those adobe structures, right? Like if you guys have been to like the Grand Canyon, you know like those brick type structures. And then the Northwest, like where we're at, they use a lot of like fisheries, right? To use like salmon. And we know like there's a lot of like salmon plants over here. And then northeast, like the Iroquois, they mix like agriculture with hunter-gatherers because they had a lot of foresty land, but they also had a lot of mountainous land with a lot of creatures. So that made it easy for them. And then all of these sort of societies, right, they had complex systems with different political systems. And they were always shaped by their environment. That's one thing that you need to take away from this unit. And then 1.2, it's more about like the natives before Europe. And it's kind of like a repeat of the previous thing. Like all of them had social hierarchies, right? And like the Aztec is one that I'll be going over. So like the Aztecs, they had like their like top guy and then they had like the sacrifices and stuff like that and gender roles around this time. Like women tend to work in the farms while men like they were seen as like stronger and more capable. So they tend to be more like hunter-gatherers. And then okay, sure. And then one like system you have to know, right, is the three sister system. So, uh, if this is one of like the farming strategies they used back then, they plant corns, beans, and squash to maximize the crop yields. And then they also did this because the previous crops would help fertilize the land. So that means that they could improve production for the next one. So those 1.1, 1.2, they're like very similar. Unit 1 is very short in like content. It's just mostly context for what is to come. So 1.3 is about the Columbian Exchange and Spanish conquest. So this one is all about the European motivations for exploration. And I know Bigwin talked about this in yesterday's class. It is the three G's that you have to know. We have God, gold, and glory. So one example of like God being one of the motivations is Spain because they sort of went on like these civilizing missions, right? Where they sought to spread Catholicism toward the new colonies and to help them by civilizing them with their like right religion. And then gold is also because of the growth of mercantilism, right? This is a theme that you'll see constantly throughout the first few units of this course, and it is about their desire for new resources because they believe that wealth is just one big pie, right? And if you want a larger slice of that pie, then you need to take more from another group or like another person's slice of pie. And then glory was because the powerful monarchs, right? A lot of them like were like family ties and stuff. So they wanted to sort of prove that their countries are better. Like they had very, very big egos, right? So like the Portuguese, they wanted to have their own spice trade. The Spanish, they wanted to go overseas and show that they have more power. So a lot of it, the glory is you just have to know it's about egos, right? They all wanted to show their strength and flex their power. And then 1.4 is all about the Spanish Empire in America because and throughout Unit 1, this is going to be like the most important empire that is talked about, that is repeated. So when the Spanish came to the Americas, right, there was something known as the Great Dying. And as a result of this, many of the Native Americans were killed due to diseases, right? Because as we remember from the Columbian exchange, right, a lot of like goods, it wasn't just goods being exchanged, like just the interaction brought along diseases that made it so the natives don't end up like passing away because of that. And then one system that the Spanish Empire were known to use was the encomienda system, which meant that which is a system where they granted them power over the Native Americans. And then this was like the goal of that was to ensure that they could like spread themselves and get power over the Native Americans. And then the caste system was like the hierarchical system that they established, right? It was a rigid social hierarchy and it was based on race. It's like we know about caste systems like from like other like regions and other like areas of the world, right? But this one was based on the top was the Spanish people, like the Spanish race from Europe, and then it just went below, below, below until like the natives were like in the end. And then they also use forced labor, right? They forced a lot of the Native Americans to work for them, and they started slavery. All right. So that was like the first hints of slavery at around this time. But you'll see later that there is a issue with this type of slavery by using the Native Americans. All right. And then 1.5 is just about the Columbian Exchange. I've repeated this a lot of times. It's about how the people of the different continents have shaped each other. So, as I mentioned, the Columbian Exchange is the exchange of not just goods, but interactions, cultures, right? So goods, diseases, animals. Like I'm pretty sure the horse was given to the Americas, and then plants as well. Like I forgot what was given here, but like plants were exchanged. I remember potatoes and stuff were given to Europe. And then there was one famous Spanish guy that you have to know, Bartolome de las Casas. And I remember when I did the exam last year, right? The first question is going to be about Unit 1, like on the MCQ. And the first one for me was something about Spanish. It was an image. And I remember the source was from this guy. So he's a very famous activist, kind of activist, but like he was also like a bad person. He advocated for better treatment for the Native Americans because he believed that they were too cruel and viewing them in too much as like a superiority complex. And then this triangular trade was also a very important aspect, right? That was the core like trade routes of the Columbian Exchange. And the Middle Passage specifically was the part from Africa to America, which transported the slaves. All right, and then Unit 2, this time period is about European colonization, right? It's from 1607 to 1754. Does anyone know what happens from like what happened in 1607 and what happened in 1754 that makes this like the outlines for this unit? Type in sorry, type in the chat if you like know what happened on these days. Yeah, French and Indian War was 1754, but do any of you guys know what happened in 1607? Yes, 1607 was the founding of the Jamestown colony, and the Jamestown colony was the very first, I'm pretty sure it's the first English settlement on the Americas. So Unit 2 is all about European colonization and their different strategies that they use to colonize the lands. All right, so I combined, you'll see from now on, I like to combine the units because some of these units get very long. They have like up to like, I forgot what the longest was, but I'm pretty sure it's up to 14 subtopics. And so the first one is 2.1 and 2.2, and it is about colonization of North America from the great powers of Europe, and there are like similarities and differences. So Let's start with Spain, right? We talked about them a lot so far. They colonized mainly Central and South America, and they also had like Florida, right, which is mentioned later. And then they utilized like the encomienda system and forced labor, and they were very, very, very brutal. That's what you have to know about them, right? Like they converted the people to Catholicism. So if there's one thing you want to take away from all these, right, is Spain, they were the most brutal. And then the other side of the coin, right, the other spectrum is the French and the Dutch. Because they developed small settlements for the fur trade, they formed by forming alliances with the natives. Because by forming these alliances with the natives who knew a lot about the land, right, and how the trade was before, and because they were so good at like getting the fur, these alliances significantly improved like their standing, like the European standing with the Native Americans. And it was just like mutually beneficial, right? Because the French and the Dutch, they provided like weapons, the new European technology to the natives, and then they just gave the Europeans what they wanted. So if you have to know one thing about the French and the Dutch, you have to know that they were like the good guys, like Spain are like the bad guys, and the French and Dutch are like the good guys. And then the English, well, they had large immigrant populations, right? And they led to the formation of larger settlements. Like Jamestown was one of the first English ones. And then, but the thing about them was they wanted separate settlements. So they wanted to be like have settlements that did not include natives. So they like didn't really want to be with them. So at the start, when there were not many English settlers, right? They were like pretty good. The English treated the natives like pretty well, pretty good enough. And then later on, they ended up encroaching upon them, right? And then we know, like, you guys know about like Bacon's Rebellion, right? Like wars like these, battles like these, were because the natives feared that England was going to be encroaching upon them. All right. And then 2.3 is all about the British regional I don't know why it says companies, colonies, right? And I think this is one of the most important things, like in the first two units. If you were to know one thing, this is the one thing that you should know, like the differences between these three colonies. So would anyone like to type in chat, right? Like if they can share any of the differences that they know of, like so far? And I think that this is really important to know, right? Because last year on my long essay question, this the one of the prompts I remember was about the similarities and differences of the colonies. And I answered that one, and I just talked about like these similarities and differences, and it worked out very, very well for me. Yeah, so let's see. The more south you go, more slavery, and more north is industrial. And yeah, exactly. So the more south you go, right, they have more of these like flat lands, and it also gets hotter. So this is just the perfect conditions for slavery, right? So as we can see, the south, they find for like crops, like cash crops, like sugar, rice, tobacco, and they use very, very large plantations to help with this because with all that land, right, they needed a lot of more people to man the like agricultural operations. So what they did was they called on slave laborers to help them. And then the middle colonies, right, like all right, so I should first say like the southern colonies is like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, like these few, right? And then the middle colonies were from Virginia up to New York. So New York is actually included within the middle colonies. I don't really know why, because I'd associate like the new as like New England, but you have to know that distinction, okay? So these people were highly diverse and they tolerated many different religions. And they were seen sort of as like the breadbasket of the country at the time, the breadbasket of the 13 colonies, because they produce almost all of the food they promoted fair trade of the natives. So them being like this basket of food, right? This allowed the South to be more focused on cash crops instead of focusing on subsistence farming, which is just farming for survival. So this made it like the middle colonies sort of allowed the southern colonies to thrive on slavery in a way. And then New England is like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, like these colonies, right? They were tight towns with diverse economies, right? And they focused a lot on trade, and these people were the Puritans. And their location and proximity towards the Atlantic Ocean and the rivers allowed them like more inward access, made very good for merchants and small farming and fishing. So that these are a few main differences of the British regional colonies. All right. And then 2.4 is all about the transatlantic trade. So going back to the idea of mercantilism, right, where wealth is a pie. So if you want to take more wealth and become wealthier, you need to take more of that pie. So this is why the triangular trade happened, right? Like some examples of what we're trading is like rum. Rum went to Africa, and then and slaves from Africa, they would then go to America, and then sugar and molasses would then go to Europe. So think about it like this, right? The Africans provided like the people, like the human capital that worked for it. And then America, they provided like the raw materials. And then the raw materials were shipped to Europe, where they were then manufactured into goods and then given to Africa. So this whole cycle. And this was evident from the Navigation Acts, right? Which is where Britain, they tightened the trade. Like they pretty much required the colonists only to trade with them and not really to interact or trade with any of the other ones. Yeah, sugar was it's also expensive because of this, that they weren't allowed to trade with other colonies. And then with the Navigation Acts, right, like you might think that the colonists would have hated it, right? But the British Isles, they used what is known as salutary neglect. So Britain, like they kind of let the colonies be their own independent country, right? So the colonies were pretty much their own independent entity. Like they had no say in the parliament, no say in the British Congress and stuff like that. Which means that Britain, like they didn't really care what they do as long as they followed the Navigation Acts, because all they wanted was trade and they wanted domination of the seas. They wanted that money. Okay. So salutary neglect was used in combination with the Navigation Acts. And this sort of made it so the colonists were fine with Britain. Right. And then next is 2.5. And this is about the relationship between the European countries and the natives. So going back to what I mentioned before, right? The Spanish, they focused on, well, they didn't focus, right? But they had harsh treatment of the natives, right? They were the worst out of all of them. With the encomienda system, which used their colonists and they employed enslaved labor, the Native Americans. And these Native Americans, since they all died of disease, right? They had needed a new force of people, a new supply of people. So that is why they used the slave trade and use that to get more people. And then the French and Dutch, they had small settlements and they were mostly known for trading alliances. So they were like the good guys out of the Europeans, right? And I think that's probably why they were like, I'd say that was one of the main reasons why they ended up ultimately getting kicked out, because they were like, they're too good of people. And then, although they still did like some bad things, but they were mostly good. And the English had large scale immigrants. They were initially nice, but like they encroached on them, right? And the medical wars, this is the big one. The natives tried to drive out the encroaching people who immigrated from England, right? Because they didn't want them to keep on taking their land, because they thought that, oh yeah, now eventually they're just going to kick us all out of our own land. Well, so that's why they started the medical wars. Like as a result of this, England won that war, and then they imposed more restrictions on the natives. And then 2.6 was all about how slavery, right? It was an increasing issue in this continent. And we know that slavery grew because of the demand for agricultural goods, right? Like sugar. We mentioned how it was like an expensive good. And what, since it was expensive, right? The supply would want to go up. Like they want to match the demand with the supply. So they can make more profits. And then Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. I remember it because the date is like it's pretty funny to me. And then uh so this marked like the shift from indentured servitude to the use of slavery. And indentured servitude was just a system of having people work for their freedom, right? So they weren't really slaves because they technically worked for something in the end, but then this rebellion was from indentured servitude servants and then how they didn't like their treatment, right? So then the people just decided to use slaves instead because they're like they won't rebel on us. And then New England, since they had small farms, they had a low number of slaves, and just because they had like a lower number, right, it doesn't mean they had none. So they had it, right? So they're guilty of committing bad acts. And the middle colonies, they had a slightly larger slave population because it's less mountainous than the north, so it is better conditions for that. And then lastly, the South, which we all know has the largest slave population. All right. And then 2.7, this is cultural change and the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening, I think, is one of the hardest topics because it's about like religion. And in history, I realized one thing that it's not necessarily that it's like boring or bland, right? But I feel like it's easier to remember like the more action focused part, like the world wars and just wars in general, because like people tend to think they're cooler, but this stuff is just as important, like the Great Awakening. So pretty much what it was is it was a religious revival challenging the ideas of the scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution, if you guys remember, was just how they believed in using like logical thinking, right? Like using science to back things. So this led like the church to grow weaker. So the people like hosted emotional sermons, right? Like some people that you have to know were like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. They were leaders of the Great Awakening. And the time period of the Great Awakening was from like the 1730s to like the 1740s. Like it was around this time, right? And then another vocab term that you probably should know is Anglicization. And this is just the spread of English culture. And the reason why it's called Anglicization is because like the English people, right, they're called the Anglo-Saxons. So if you know that, then you can just figure out what Anglicization means. So it's much easier. And then the Enlightenment and John Locke, like these ideas, right? They started to grow because of the Great Awakening, right? Like the belief of life, liberty, and property, and how that is what made citizens. They started the movement for the colonies to consider new independence from Britain. And this partnered with the salutary neglect, right? Since Britain wasn't really involved that much, they sort of felt like they were already an independent country. All right. So that is the end of Unit 2. And then Unit 3 is about the American Revolution and the formation of the nation. So, what does anyone know what happened like between these two time periods? Like what happened in 1800? Like why would the unit end here if it's about the foundation of the nation? So American Revolution is what happened, is like the main topic of this unit. And George Washington, like he was like a very big figure. So in 1800, it was known as like the first peaceful transition of power, which I'll get into later. So this unit 3 is very, very long, right? So I wanted to like condense it down so it's not as long and you feel a little bit better about like the length. So I just included the important ideas. And from like this unit onward, I pretty much incorporated like 3 units into one slide, like 3 subtopics, which I think fits really well because there's only there's a lot of like not really like that essential information in a lot of these units. So 3.1, 3.2, and 3 is all about the French and Indian Wars, right? And how they started taxing after that. So the French and Indian Wars, also known as like the 7 Years' War, right? This was mainly fought in Europe, but it also had a theater in the Americas. And you don't really have to know any of the details. The only stuff you have to know, like only details, right? Is that Native Americans were involved in both sides. So a lot of them like were from the same tribe, right? And they were pitted against each other in this war. And in this war, we saw Britain defeat France in this war, right? So that led to Britain taking over all of like France's colonies, right? Their colonies in Canada, their colonies in the Americas. So Britain had all this new extra land, right? But in return, they were in a lot of debt because of this war. So since they were broke in their mainland, right? They decided to tax the colonies, which they would come to realize, like in hindsight, is a very bad decision. And also, another important event that happened was the Proclamation of 1763. So, from this, the Britain banned the colonists from moving past the Appalachian, right? They deemed this as like a native-only territory and didn't want their colonists to move here in fear of like enraging the natives. So, they banned them. And if you don't know where the Appalachian Mountains are, right? It's like it goes through like New York, Pennsylvania. Like there's still land to the east of it, but it's pretty like it's very, very far east. So that's why the colonists were unhappy because there's so much land and potential with moving past that. And then with taxation came the rise of no taxation without representation, right? Because they're like, why should we get taxed if you guys are making decisions, but we have no say in it, right? It's like when you're young and a kid and your parents are making decisions for you on like what sports you want to do. So they just sign you up for all of them. And then some important like taxing acts you have to know, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act. Like the Stamp Act, they just made it so if whenever you buy a product, right, and it gets stamped, you have to pay like some extra tax on that. And then also John Locke and his Enlightenment ideals. These were like the root of many of the revolutions around the world, and specifically the American Revolution. The Enlightenment ideas from him, like independence and life and property and the pursuit of happiness, which you'll see later. All right. And then 3.4, 5, and 6 is all about the foundations like leading up to the American Revolution. So it's about like what happened before the actual revolution happened and what set in stone, like why it happened. So the Enlightenment was the idea of the natural right and the social contract, right? Because people were believed to have these few natural rights like life, liberty, and property. Like everyone was supposed to have that. And but uh if everyone has that, then there's gonna be and you have no governance, no like government, like no one to like help govern and enforce these laws, then that's just an anarchy system. And we know that anarchy is not good because no laws means that like there's gonna be people like doing very unethical things, right? So that's why they believe in the social contract. You have to sacrifice some of your individual rights, right? In return for freedom and to be governed by a specific body. And this social contract is so important because we'll see emphasized later on, like when we're drafting the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution. So one of the main documents that you'll have to know is about Thomas Paine and his document called Common Sense, right? And in short, it was just a mass printed, mass produced pamphlet. And what it did was it outlined the importance of getting independence from Britain and how America would thrive on its own. So the Declaration of Independence, right? This was formed, in which one of the famous words that you have to know about it is unalienable rights. So rights that can't be taken away from them, right? And the idea of republicanism. So this is just the idea that everyone, like every citizen, should have a sway in like politics, right? In voting. And in the original draft, they wanted to say that all men are created equal, but then they ultimately decided to leave it out of it, right? Because first of all, getting the vastly different 13 colonies, right? Because we know we talked about before, they had very different cultures. Getting them all to unite is very, very, very hard. So the North, they decided to keep the all men are equal clause thingy out of the Declaration of Independence because they didn't want to anger the people from the South because they don't want them to leave. And then one of the important battle, like there's so many battles about the American Revolution. I can get into so many of them, but one of the two most important ones are Saratoga and Yorktown. So in to summarize Saratoga, right, it was a city in New York called Saratoga, and then there was the Britain, they wanted to take it so they could cut off the American colonies into two. So then at this war, the Americans kept reinforcing it, and then eventually they won this war, right? It was a very decisive battle, and the French were supporting the Americans like economically and like sort of like socially this whole time, right? They all wanted them to win, also finally decided to join the war after that. And I'm pretty sure Spain joined the war at around that time as well, because they had confidence, right, that the colonists were not just a group of like bandits that didn't know what they were doing. It was proof that they could stand up for themselves. And then Yorktown, it was like the final nail in the coffin for the British in staying in the American colonies. It was just like a siege where eventually like the British were pushed to Yorktown, and then like with a siege and like Navy and Army, they ended up taking them over and they had to surrender. And this led to the Treaty of Paris, right? Which did a lot of reform. It gave America like what was known back then as like the Northwestern Territories. It kind of includes like where you guys know like Michigan, Minnesota, like Wisconsin, like those areas, like all the areas like below like what where Canada is now were given to the Americans after Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. And then well, as a result of that, right, since the Americans could govern how they wanted with that land, that means the Proclamation of 1763 was overridden. And lastly, Republican motherhood was one of the main things, like the changing of gender roles, of women getting more involved, because a lot of the men went to go fight in the war, right? So they had to take up more important positions. All right, so that was a very, very, very long thing to digest. And 3.7, 8, and 9 is all about like the form how America was actually going to start governing as their own independent nation. So this is about the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. So would anyone like to point out like what are the Articles of Confederation? Like some key like details about it. Like yeah, it didn't have a Bill of Rights, right? And that was actually added because of uh the anti-federalists, which I'll talk about in a sec. So there are a few main reasons why the Articles of Confederations failed, right? Failed because I'm pretty sure it declared like I forgot what the exact wording was, right? And this was the first frame of government. I forgot the exact wording, but it pretty much said it was an alliance of the 13 states, or like it didn't mention it being like one union. So that was first of all what made it really weak. Loose it was a very loose alliance, and the government had pretty much like no rights, right? Like the state governments had rights like over almost everything that the government has now. Like the national government, they couldn't tax. It was the role of the states to tax their own citizens, right, and collect their own taxes. So you can see how inefficient that would be. There was no national army, so that means that every state had their own militias, right? Like Georgia had their own militia, South Carolina had their own militia, Massachusetts had their own militia, and on and on and on. So then when Shays' rebellion occurred, right? I forgot which state it was. Do any of you guys remember which state Shays' rebellion was in? Okay, yeah, Massachusetts. That does sound right. Yeah. So in Massachusetts, Shea rebelled, and since like the state militia was too weak to put it down, right? They had to request for aid, like financial aid, as well as soldiers from the other militias, and this just proved to be a very inefficient system. So ultimately, they met at the Constitutional Convention because they wanted to rewrite the Articles of Confederation. And one key detail about the Articles, right, is that for any changes to occur, it must be a unanimous decision. So 13 out of the 13 states have to like agree to it, agree to the terms. So what happened then was the Great Compromise. Do any of you guys know what happened in the Great Compromise or like the result of it? I'm pretty sure it's also known sometimes as like the Connecticut Compromise and Virginia Compromise. All right, so pretty much what happened because of the Great Compromise was that since these states, right, they needed to figure out a way to get representation because so the smaller states like Connecticut and these other like Connecticut, Delaware, Rhode Island, they wanted every state to have only one vote because that means that they would have more power, right? But states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, they were like, that's not fair because we have more people, right? Like more people in this nation are under us. So yeah, it was a dispute on how they should get representatives, right? So like because of this, they had to compromise and they formed the bicameral legislature. And if you don't know what that means, it's just the formation of the House and the Senate. So the House is based on a proportion of the population of each state, right, compared to each other. And then the Senate population is based on two per state. So that meant that the small states have power as well as like the larger states, they have more power. And then another debate that was around this time, right, was the three-fifths compromise that was signed in. So does anyone here know what the three-fifths compromise was? Or remember what it was? Right, okay. What is the three? Yes, exactly. A slave was represented as three-fifths of a person, right? So like the South, they had a very, very large slave population. And because they wanted to use their slaves in counting their representatives, right? So they're like, so then they agreed that each slave counts as three-fifths of a person. So then that like just it just fundamentally that just doesn't make sense at all, right? Because you can't have 60% of a person, right? Like if you have two of them, you can have like 1.2 people. And they just did that because they could have more votes. And now, like around then, there were two parties, right, known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists were people who believed in a stronger national government. They believed that it was necessary. And some famous Federalists are like Alexander Hamilton, right? And anti-federalists, they pushed for more state involvement, and they believed that the new constitution that was being formed, it gave the central government too much rights, like too much power. So they demanded a Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is like the amendments, you know, right? Like the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and stuff like that. And this held foreign checks and balances, right? Like the three branches, they could check each other and balance each other out, the judicial, the executive, the legislative. And then when a similar rebellion to the to Shays' rebellion happened, the Whisker Rebellion, we saw that the government was able to get their own national militia to go and stop the rebellion once and for all. So that was proof that the new constitution was going to be like the blueprint that they should use and that they should move away from the articles. And then 3.10, right? This is about the cabinet system. So when George Washington took office, right, he had advisors and then he instated his own two-term limit, which was not really like official at the time, which you'll see later, like Franklin Roosevelt, right? He had four terms, but later is enacted that the two-term limit, and this is because of him. And one important thing to know is the Judiciary Act. So this created a Supreme Court, right? There were six people on the Supreme Court with one Chief Justice. And I don't know why they decided to choose like an even number, right? Because think about it, three people agree one way and three people agree a different way. Like, how would you figure that out? So just the first Supreme Court had six people, and there's significant changes that would happen later. And then the Hamilton, he had his own financial plan, right? He wanted the to create a national bank. He wanted the national government to assume the state's debts and to raise revenue through taxation. And the Federalists, they were for the national bank because they believed the stronger central government would allow the general people to prosper more. Whereas the anti-federalists, they were against the national bank because they believed that it infringed states' rights, right? And it took away too many. It'd be government encroachment. They didn't want a repeat of why they wanted independence in the first place. So they didn't want to make those mistakes of like the monarchy. And then John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Acts were signed, and these acts was like it was the first form of uh like restrictions against people, and it kind of just targeted immigrants. And then one important speech you need to know, and for some reason like the AP College Board they love this, is Washington's farewell speech. So when he was like resigning from presidency, right, he just gave a speech and he warned against the formation of political parties. Like, if there's one thing to take away, it's to stay neutral in the affairs of Europe and to not form political parties, which we saw from the next two president, they formed political parties. So, and and this next one, 3.11, is about the development of an American national identity, right? So cultural nationalism was a big thing. Like America, they had their own distinct art, religion, and architecture. And they're the first like country ever to have like an egalitarian society, right? They promoted equality as well as facilitating like the separation of church and state. Because we know like in Europe, right, they had the church and state like together, but whereas we wanted like more separation. But at this time, regional differences were growing more, and one of the main issues was about slavery. So what they did was gradual emancipation. So they would gradually emancipate the slaves in the country like after some time, because the South were still slave states, and the North started to become more of free states. And then at this time, westward expansion also started to grow, right? Like the population and the desire for land led to this. And with the proclamation of 1763 being overturned, and that just allowed for more people to expand west, right? And then when these people expanded west, the Native Americans who previously lived there and moved there because of the previous act, they started to like conflict was inevitable to arise because they were living on the same land. And the British remained in this region around this time, right? Like they still controlled like modern day Canada. And they did this and they supported the native resistance against the Americans. And the government, like they encouraged these new settlements. They wanted to expand west. And the Northwest Ordinance is an important vocabulary term to know. It was the thing that created the process for admitting states. And the goal of this was it banned slaves, like banned slavery in the new territory. Like the Northwest was at this time, if you remember, was like Michigan, like Illinois, like this area. So the Northwest Ordinance created that state admission process. And then Unit 4 is about the early republic from 1800s to 1848. So does anyone know the significance of this time period? Like why it ended at the time it did and what the time period was known as. Yeah, so 1848 is the end of the Mexican-American War, and the peaceful transition of power to the Civil War was all like covered within this time period. So let's get into it. So I combined the first four units. It is about Jeffersonian, like Jefferson, right? Sectionalism, like growing like sections, and also the formation of the Monroe Doctrine, which was 4.4, but I just combined it in here because it's very, very simple. And the first party system, right? There's many party systems that we learn. It was the Federalists, and one of the main figures was Alexander Hamilton, and from the previous mention of the like the first national bank, right? And then versus the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson, who believed more in like states' right and like agriculture. And then in the election of 1800, right? This I mentioned before, it was about the peaceful transition of power from party to party. And then Marbury versus Madison was a famous court case around this time, right? They were still trying to figure out how the power should be divided. So this established like judicial review and the necessary and proper clause. So do you guys know, like, what do you guys know about the necessary and proper clause? It's a very important legislation. Necessary and proper. So pretty much what it did was they allowed the government, like in a time of need, right, to do what is necessary and proper for the government to uphold its values. And then at around this time, like the Democratic Republicans pretty much ended up becoming the majority, right? And because of that, they ended up inevitably like splitting up into two, and they formed the Democrats and the Whigs. So that is the second party system, Democrats versus the Whigs. And then Henry Clay, right? He is a very important person that you have to know. He's like very versatile. Like he's done a lot and he's mentioned a lot in like the curriculum. So he wanted high protective tariffs, right? Because he wanted to boost the American industry. He wanted the formation of the second US national bank. So like more national control, and then also wanted more federally funded improvement, like infrastructure. He wanted more of that, like roads and stuff. And the slavery was still a big debate around this time, right? It was like one of the main debates. And the Missouri Compromise. What do you guys know about the Missouri Compromise so far? Yeah, so it is about the issues, right, of admitting states. So because the balance of power was that uh, there were an equal amount of slave states and an equal amount of non-slave states. And then with the admission of Missouri, right, they wanted to determine whether Missouri should be a slave state. So Missouri ultimately was admitted as a slave state, and it banned slavery above a certain line. And for the admission of a slave state, they had to admit like a non-slave state as well, right? So that is why they ultimately decided to admit Maine as a state. And then the Monroe Doctrine was a very important belief that was formed by the President James Monroe. He believed that the Western Hemisphere, it was closed and it was like destined to be controlled by the United States and the United States only, because he thought it was their like duty to like rule the area and maintain control. All right. And then next, 4.5 and 6 is all about the market revolution. So what do we know about the market revolution so far? Yeah, so the market revolution, it was like the shift the production to factories, from like the textiles, right? So it started with one key invention is the cotton gin, like Eli Whitney's invention. It made farming cotton much more efficient and easier. And then also textile factories, right? Because it used to be like cottage industries producing everything at home, and like the Lowell system, which transformed production by employing a lot of women. And this led to more like sort of like reform movements for them, right? And then new transportation like the Erie Canal and the steamboats made it much more efficient to transport and trade goods. And then like urbanization and immigration will also happen more at this time, right? Because with the more transportation, more people could immigrate over, and then with more factories, right? And with jobs sort of being centered around them, more people started moving to cities. And then this led to the belief of the separate spheres ideology, right? Like going back to like this is a common theme throughout, right? Like how the men were supposed to be hunters and gatherers, while the women were supposed to work on the farms. Now the women were supposed to like sort of govern the home, like take care of the kids, and the men were supposed to work in like the factories and like work outside. And at around this time, we also saw like regional independence. Like the North, they kind of did stuff on their own, and the South, like this sort of like facilitated the divide even more. Where the South shifted more radical, more towards slavery. All right, and then 4 point, why it says 4.8? It says supposed to be 7 and 8. Was all about expanding democracy and the Jefferson era, right? So because of we saw the expansion of suffrage at around this time, because to be able to vote before, it required property requirements, right? Like you needed to own land, own houses to be able to vote. And this made it so when people ran their campaigns, they sort of diverted it, or mostly wanted to fit the requirements of the rich people. And then because of this like mass democratization, the common man ideology led by Andrew Jackson was used, and he ultimately won the 1928 election. And he used like the spoil system. So the spoil system is just that it's as it sounds, right? Like you spoil the people who helped you get there. And it's about like nepotism. Like he just gave the people he supported cabinet positions and powerful positions. And Andrew Jackson, he was a very like different president. Like he's seen as like the first king of America, if you've seen that political cartoon, if you know. And then the bank war also happened now. Like they wanted to recharter the second bank, but Jackson vetoed it because he thought it'd be corrupt and like an overreach of government power, right? And then also the nullification crisis happened around now, where South Carolina, they wanted to nullify like a tariff agreement, right? But then ultimately the government ruled over it, like proving that the government has like the national government has like final say over stuff. And then the Indian Removal Act was where the president showed like the weakness of the Supreme Court, right? Like the Supreme Court could decide any cases, but the president could just, and the states, they could just choose to ignore them. So ultimately, Jackson ended up kicking a lot of the Native Americans out of the land. All right. And then 4.9, 10, 11 is all about reform and like awake and like second great awakening, right? So a belief that arises now was transcendentalism, and it is the philosophy of emphasizing emotion over rationalism. And this sort of is what led to the second great awakening, right? It was a religious arrival. It emphasized salvation in response to market materialism. And pretty much what this means is that someone that you can change your outcome, right? You can go to heaven if you do good deeds, or else like you won't. And then market materialism is just like mass, like the first form of consumer culture we had, right? Since these goods were being produced everywhere. And then these like fueled reform movements, as we know, right? Like abolition, like which is the banning of slavery. No, yeah, banning of slavery. Sorry, I got confused with something else. And then like women's rights and like the Seneca Falls Conventions, as well as temperance, which is the banning of alcohol. All right, and then 4.12 and 13 is all about. Did someone raise their hand? Do you have a question? Raise your hand. Okay, all right,
Oh
you're all good.
no, I pressed the wrong button. My computer malfunctioned.
Okay, it's all good. No worries. Don't worry about it. And then 4.12 and 13 is all about African Americans and the American South, so around this time. So at this time, we saw the formation of the Underground Railroad, right? And this was the way that slaves like escaped the South. And one famous abolition and the famous abolitionist that led that was Harriet Tubman, if you know. And like we all love Harriet Tubman, right? And then Frederick Douglass is another important person to know. He was an abolitionist and a writer. He escaped slavery and went to Canada and just wrote about how it was bad. And then King Cotton was the like sort of social belief at around this time, like the cotton gin, as I previously mentioned by Eli Whitney, it made cotton like sort of like a king of the industry because it could be mass produced and the demand from Europe and other areas was so high, so it was very, very profitable. And this further facilitated the divide between North and South, right? South shifted even more toward agriculture, and the North started shifting more and more toward manufacturing. So you can see the clear difference, like the delineation between the two. All right, and the next is about it's Unit 5, Manifest Destiny and the Civil War. So do you guys know what happened between these two times? Like this is one of the more specific time frames. Yeah, Dred Scott and the Confederates, right? Sorry, what do you guys know about Reconstruction? So 1877, if you don't know, was when Reconstruction ended. So 5.1, 2, and 3 is all about Manifest Destiny and the Mexican-American War. So there's a typo here. Manifest Destiny was about the belief that the America was destined by God to expand across the continent, right? So this is one of the main factors that led to westward expansion because they believed that they were supposed to be the ones that inhabit this. And then this belief of manifest destiny, right, was the first form of nationalism, which is where they all believe in their own common American identity. And we also saw population growth, right, because of better healthcare and stuff like that. We also saw the economic growth and the gold rush in 1849. People wanted to move west because of the gold rush, because they wanted to get wealthy. They believed that they were different and that that was their opportunity of striking gold. But ultimately, failed, and like a lot of not like it failed, right? But a lot of people they did not get rich, and a lot of people got rich from like selling like tools like pickaxes and stuff. But more importantly, there were a lot more people that moved over here, right? So this allowed for the formation of like more societies. And then at around this time, America, like they got a lot of new territory, right? Like they annexed Texas, like Texas annexation, like the war against Mexico, and the Oregon territories, which they split with Britain, as well as the Mexican cession. So with these new territories, right? The debates rose up again about whether the new slaves should be admitted as slave states or not. And during the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, it ended the Mexican-American War. There were four new states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and I'm pretty sure Texas. They were all admitted to the Union, but in return, America had to pay 15 million for them. But with these new states, like it was still so hard to determine whether or not they should be slave states or not. Like this divide started growing even more. And this is one of the fruits for the Civil War. So 5.4, 5, and 6 is all about slavery and the debates that occurred over it. So do you guys know what the Compromise of 1850 was? I'll give you guys a hint. It was about it's similar to the Missouri Compromise. It was that they wanted to admit new slaves, right? And this act, it established the Fugitive Slave Act. So pretty much it allowed people to escape, like people, slave owners in the South, to escape to the North to go and capture escaped slaves. And popular sovereignty was formed around this time. And this cultural divide, like as I mentioned before, it was increasing, increasing. And a famous novel known as Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was it highlighted the brutality of slavery and made the North want to end it even more. And this led to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? Where Stephen Douglas, he's a very important figure that I'll mention later on. They ultimately agreed to allow popular sovereignty to determine if the new territories would be slaves or not, like slave states or not. So that led to Oh yeah, and popular sovereignty was just allowing the people to vote for it to be a slave state or a free state. So bleeding Kansas was what resulted from this. And you can tell from the name, right? Like bleeding, it was there was a lot of lives lost. So what happened was settlers rushed in and they wanted to sway the road. They massacred each other. And it was a very big failure. And then an important court case you didn't know at the time is Dred Scott, the Dred Scott case, right? It ruled that Black people were not citizens and that Congress can't restrict the slavery, and it deemed the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. So that means that lines above, like states above the line, could still be admitted as slave states. All right, and then 7, 8, and 9 is all about Lincoln and the Civil War. So with the election of 1860, the Democratic Party split, and then the Republican Lincoln ultimately won the war. And that was too much of a divide to happen, right? So the South ended up seceding from the Union. And with the secession, we saw like South Carolina came first, and then the whole South seceded, and they formed the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy, and their leader was Stephen Douglas, the guy who did the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Battle of Fort Sumter was the start of the war. So, the war, like for some context, right? The North, they were heavy, heavy favorites. Like they had almost all the factories, railroads, farmland, and a much larger population. So they decided to use the Anaconda Plan, which is to blockade the South with a naval blockade. So they can't trade with other European countries, they can't trade with others and beg for support. And then one very important victory was the Battle of Vicksburg, in which General Ulysses S. Grant, not Grant, I don't know why I spelled that wrong, uh, gained control of the Mississippi River. And then the Battle of Gettysburg prompted Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address and Emancipation Proclamation, which would ensure that slavery would end. And then he also established like the national currency, right? And green banks so they can fund for the war as well as the National Bank Act. And during this time of war, there's some very questionable processes that happen. Like Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which is the right to a trial, because he deemed that in a time of war, like this type of censorship was allowed. All right. All right, and then this is the last one for today. It's about Reconstruction and why it failed. So pretty much there were two beliefs of reconstru of two approaches, I should say, to Reconstruction, right? The first one is presidential Reconstruction, and Lincoln and his Vice President Johnson, they both wanted this. It was a fast unification. It was very lenient on the South, like not too much punishment. And then the other belief was radical Reconstruction, which their belief was they wanted to significantly punish the South because of what they did. So as a result of the Civil War, right, there were a lot of new amendments passed. The 13th banned slavery. The 14th allowed for citizenship and the formation of like the EPA. And then also the 15th provided voting rights to the black man. But in the process of Reconstruction, right, there was still Southern resistance because you can't flip that switch overnight, right? From from being a slave state to just suddenly being free. So they still had resistance, like the Black Codes, sharecropping, which was slavery, but like under a new name, and the formation of radical groups like the KKK. And then ultimately, Reconstruction ended in 1877 because of the Compromise of 1877, which was a very, very close presidential election. And ultimately, President Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as president. But in return for that, the federal government, they promised to remove their troops from the South. And that marked the end of Reconstruction and the failure to like help them rebuild. All right, so that is all for today. Thank you guys so much for coming to our session for today. Tomorrow we will cover the rest of the units and then we'll go over like some potential prompts for LEQs. All right, thank you.